With market oversaturation, people are overwhelmed by the vast amount of content available to consume. That's why podcasting is such an essential strategy for business promotion. However, starting your own podcast is no simple feat. You need the right guidance to make sure that your podcast stands out from the rest and puts you on the path towards success. That's where my podcast launch intensive comes in. It provides a 10-week intensive training course with 4 to 5 activities for people to complete each week, allowing them to overcome the common obstacles for a podcast launch. The main goal of the podcast launch intensive is to help you save on time, effort, and money caused by common do-it-yourself podcast mistakes. It's about making intentional decisions that will help you get started and find success in your podcasting journey. Join the intensive today. Visit dannyosmond.com/PLI to find out more. Welcome back, everybody. I am really excited for this week's episode. Last week I had one of my clients, Paul Klein, on, and he talked a lot about pricing and how we can improve our business by just getting our pricing right when we're making proposals and things like that. And he also shared some nuggets there as well. This week I have another client on, Geoff Kullman. Geoff is an amazing copywriter. He's an expert at copywriting. And he came on and we had a great discussion about, the why of copywriting and the how of copywriting. His podcast is called The Psychology of Copywriting. And he really dives into that, of why we do it and how it works. And we talked about things like, why should businesses care about copywriting, and what common mistakes people make in copywriting? And also, what happens in someone's brain when they hear a story? In copywriting, we use story a lot. And in podcasting, we use it as well. So we went into what's happening inside the brains. And then Geoff gives us some of his go-to copywriting techniques. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode. Without further ado, here's Geoff. Okay, so Geoff, you are now a client of mine. So this is an interesting interview for me. You're also a friend. Like we've been in a mastermind together now for over a year, at least. I think it's over a year. Mm-hmm. I've been in that mastermind for a long time, so it's hard to keep track of. But I love your podcast, Psychology of Copywriting, because it's a very different take on the podcast that I'm used to. I have probably 10 clients who have marketing podcasts, who have podcasts that talk about copywriting all the time, people who are copywriters. But yours is a very different spin on getting into the why of copywriting. Why does it work? How does it work? So I'll maybe start in the deep scientific end of this and back up to some of the basics. But why should someone care? Why should a personal brand care? Why should a business care about neuroscience, about psychology, and the scientific stuff that you're infusing into copywriting?
It's a great question. The simplest way that I've found to answer that. So mutual friend of ours, Mike Kim, him and Ray Edwards teamed up and they sold some copywriting templates, and they said only amateurs start from scratch. That was their tagline. I would adapt that and say, as copywriters, as marketers, only amateurs just write as an art form, right? Or even doing sales. But if you're actually professional, if you're actually wanting to do copywriting as a career, or if you already are, your copy is going to be weak. It's not going to be as strong as it could be if you're not figuring out what's going on in your client's brain, in your prospect's brain. And that's I've always kind of geeked out on this stuff anyway. So it was natural for me just to combine the art and the science of copywriting. But if you really want to be driving your own sales or your client's sales, there's no excuse to not be looking into this stuff. Any other job, if we used to have a desk job or whatever, you'd get really good at your job by researching it, by figuring it out, by figuring out better ways to do things or whatever. And that's exactly what neuroscience and linguistics and psychology teach us about the art of copywriting, is how to do it better, how to increase sales by using little tricks and hacks to to get inside people's brains.
Yeah, it reminds me, we're on a podcast talking about podcasting, and I know that copywriting is an important tool for anyone, any brand, any business. But it reminds me of what I talk about a lot with podcasters is why do podcasts work? Why do they create a stronger relationship than a lot of other things? And it does come down to that art, the psychology of it. I joke a lot that people who are listening to podcasts, they are, they're doing everything. They're in the cars, they're working out, but they're also getting ready in the morning. They're inviting you into their lives at times when normally the only other person there would be a partner, a family member, or something like that. So I can see how that psychological connection or influence is very important. Whenever you're selling something, whenever you're asking someone to do something or follow something or download something. So what are the biggest mistakes that businesses, brands, people who are starting communities, what mistakes are they making with copywriting and marketing? And how do you, as someone who is a copywriter and also teaching people about copywriting, how do you help them fix those mistakes?
Yeah, there's so many, again, amateur versus professional. I mean, it sounds rude, and I'm Canadian, so I'm feeling the offense. I feel like apologizing, but I won't. There's a few really key ideas that we can get into. The first one, though, is it ties right into podcasting, about building that trust, right? I think you say, we've been naked together, essentially. Because you're doing your morning routine and you're listening to a podcast. Study after study after study just show that building trust, building relationships builds revenue, increases sales, right? So just the idea through copy, even, that you can build that trust, which builds that relationship, which builds the revenue. And one of the ways to do that, one of the really easy ways to do that, is aligning your brand voice, the way that you talk, what you talk about, how you say it, essentially your brand personality, aligning that to your client, your ideal client's aspirations. So figuring out, what's going on in their brain. And this goes way beyond just building out an avatar, but doing deep research and figuring out who they are on a much deeper level, so that you can speak in a way and say certain things that are going to really make them pay attention, make their brain light up like a Christmas tree, and build that connection with you. Maybe you've heard the saying, synapses that fire together wire together. Well, you essentially want your brand and their brand to wire together, right? And that's what you can do by building that alignment between what you say, how you say it, and their dreams, their aspirations, their goals. That's been the biggest way that I think most people are missing out on. They build an avatar and then they just they might touch on it, but they never actually do the work of figuring out how do we align ourselves with our ideal client.
Mm-hmm. One of the things with podcasting that really connects with people and helps that relationship be so authentic between the podcasting host and the listener is the fact that this is almost a primal thing for people listening to podcasts. Since we've been in caves, we've been sharing stories, right? We've been telling stories, and that's how information has been passed on. That's how that's how we've connected with each other and passed our information down through different generations. And I know that you, as a copywriter, significantly started in I won't say who, but focusing mostly on stories and using story in your copywriting and story-based approaches. And like I said, I've heard probably 10 of my clients talk about stories and how to write stories and use them in copywriting. But since you talk more about what's going on scientifically and what's going on in the brain, what is happening in someone's brain, the listener's brain, the reader's brain, when someone hears or reads a story? Why are they so powerful?
Yeah. Well, we don't have to mention the story thing, but I mean, stories help to build your brand.
Yeah.
Maybe people can draw the connection there. Yeah, stories are so powerful. And I just released an episode of my podcast about the amount that the human brain daydreams. It's like 46.9% of the time the human mind is wandering. And which is an evolutionary marvel. It means that, we didn't have to just focus on exactly what was going on in that present moment. We had the margin to be able to build in daydreaming, project ourselves to somewhere that we're not, either in the past or the present moment, but somewhere else, or the future. And that's helped us thrive as a species, but it's also meant that our brains developed the ability to tell story and to imagine. And which is fascinating in its own right. And really, stories, they engage so many different parts of the brain. Like the visual cortex is going off, right? Like so much is happening in the brain as people are engaged in a story. And it's fascinating because the story starts to do the daydreaming for us. So essentially, through copy, as you're writing out story-based marketing, you can kind of direct where their wanderings are going. You can, not manipulatively, you don't want to do that, or maybe you do, but I don't. I meant the listener, not you, Danny. But anyway.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I know. Yeah. Like you hear the people out there that they are using copywriting to manipulate people into a sale. You see them all the time on social media.
Yeah.
And you are not one of those types of people.
Try not to be. So yeah, you can direct where their imagination is going to go. If you're selling a bottle of wine, you can take them to Tuscany. If you're selling a widget, you can take them to that after state of what life looks like once they've used your product. You can project that for them, which is what makes it so powerful. So it's not just about, once upon a time. It's not just storytelling for the sake of storytelling. It's telling a story that, again, connects deeply with their values, with their hopes, their dreams, their aspirations, because you've done that research. The story that they need to hear. And it's taking them on the journey that ends in purchasing your product. I actually read some research done by PsyOps, psychological operations in the U.S. military, about their specific story formula for turning terrorists into assets, right? So, I mean, if a story can do that, it's obviously very, very, very powerful. What they found was it needs to be incredibly relevant, so it has to be believable. You can't just tell a fairy tale. The context has to make sense for their existing situation. And they have to identify with the main character as well, obviously, because that's who you want them to see themselves as in the story. And there's a bunch of other facets in there. But the power of story, it doesn't just sell our stuff. I mean, it turns terrorists into better people. Well, I'm not going to say good people, but into better people.
Right.
So if story can do that, certainly we can use it to sell our widgets and get more clients.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to take a moment to remind people. So your podcast is called The Psychology of Copywriting. And, I think the Daydream episode is episode 5, right? I think I listened to it today. Yeah. It's coming out next week at the time we're recording this. And I just want to urge people to check out this podcast, The Psychology of Copywriting, because I've already heard at least 3 or 4 different articles with just the strangest things that you have now taken and turned into information about why copywriting is so effective. And you're sharing this in every episode. Each episode has scientific research that you're talking about. You answer questions. You're doing all these things. And I could ask you about 5 or 6 different things, but I want to get into, for someone like me, I have a team, I have support. I'm smart enough to know that, like, I'm not the best copywriter. So I hire someone to write things like emails where I'm going to sell something, or welcome sequences that lead people once they join my email list into getting to know me and getting to know what's available to them so that hopefully they become a customer. I'm smart enough to know that. But and I also have the resources where I can do that. I believe everybody, even with reasonable resources, you can find somebody to write copy that's better than you, and you're probably going to make more money when you outsource that type of thing. But for someone who really needs to understand, like, why the heck is this working? Like, what should I do if I'm writing an email, if I'm creating a landing page, if I'm writing my about page, if I'm writing a sales page, where at some point in that copy, I'm trying to get somebody to do something. I think the term is direct response, right? I want them to click something, buy something, email, like whatever. What are the keys to that? Like, what should I really focus in on if I'm trying to do that myself that actually helps me connect with potential customers or potential email list subscribers, and then keeps them there, keeps them engaged, and then hopefully makes my bottom line improve over time as a business? What should I be focusing on?
A few things. First of all, never send. Don't hit send too early, right? Or publish, whichever. If it's a sales page or an email. Whatever you're writing, sleep on it before you send it, because you're always going to reread it and change a bunch of stuff. At least I do, and I do this for a living. I come back to it and I go, "Ooh, what was I trying to say there?" And you can tell when people have just clicked send on an email. Maybe there's not typos, maybe there's not grammatical errors, but you can still tell it's loose, it's not tight. There's extra words. There's this lack of focus to the email, so you can always tell. So practically speaking, just sleep on it or come back to it even an hour or two later, and edit the thing down so it makes more sense, so it's more clear and more crisp. And then click send or click publish. Another really important thing, especially it doesn't have to be on sales pages, but it especially works on sales pages, is to open up loops in what you're writing. So you've probably seen really good writers do this in their copy. We've all seen this on TV shows back when we watched, on cable with commercials, and then we'd have to wait a week for the next episode. But the cliffhanger where an episode ends, or even right before commercial break, where it leaves you with that cliffhanger, so you have to stick around or you have to come back next week. Build that into your copy of say, hey, I'm going to talk to you about this, this, and this, but first I just wanted to say this. So that you build a bit of that anticipation. What song is it by Queen? We Are the Champions. At the end of the song, if you go on YouTube or Spotify and listen to it right now, or once this episode's done, our brains remember that song usually as ending with "We Are the Champions of the World," but it actually just ends with "We Are the Champions," and it doesn't have "of the world" at the end, and it bothers our brains that they don't finish that line. It leaves that loop open. There's this dissonance there, right? So, and tons of this, of course, with music in general, but the brain wants completion. The brain needs that completion. So when you open up a loop with a story, or just build that anticipation and tell them you're going to come back to it, the brain has to stay engaged. And so as you keep them engaged further and further down the page, you have the opportunity to do things we've already talked about, to align what your product is with their values and their aspirations and all those things. And then you wrap up the story, and that's you've got them happy now because their brain's feeling good. You've resolved that dissonance. Then you can make the pitch. Then you can make the sale at that point. And again, whether it's in an email or a sales page or a sales script, the same applies.
Yeah. And I mean, I know, like we've mentioned Mike Kim already.
Mm-hmm.
I have both learned from him, but I like what he's talked about for a while about, he calls them his magic words or his phrases that he uses. I get why those things are working, but what is happening when people see certain words? Is it something like you're saying with the loop and the brain wants to close it? Like, what's actually happening with that?
Sometimes it's that. A lot of times it's that our brains are, and this goes back to story as well, but our brains make sense of the world through seeing patterns, right? So that's why a story format works so well, because our brain is comfortable with that pattern. Our brain looks for that pattern. So even things like Mike's magic words, those aren't necessarily patterns, but they're something that the brain just recognizes as, oh, this is something I need to pay attention to. This is going to be good. So you don't want to, not a pattern in that it's repetitive. You don't want to be overly repetitive in your copy, but you want to, again, help the brain recognize, oh, this is a pattern. I want to pay attention. I want to see if this resolves. I want to see if this pattern completes. So yeah, the brain's just fascinating. We really do understand more about space than we do about the human brain at this point. Yeah. And even a bunch of the studies that I read, or the majority of the studies that I read, they still say, well, we think this, or this is still unknown, or there's still debate about, even I was reading a study yesterday, getting prepped for an episode of the podcast, that there's still debate about how many parts there are in the prefrontal cortex. The majority opinion is probably that there's 5, but there's a lot of there's debate about how many parts are in the prefrontal cortex. So there's still a lot for us to figure out in the brain, but we do know it loves patterns. That's why stories work. That's why all this stuff works, because the brain's trying to make sense of what's going on around us.
Yeah,
and that's one of the ways
I think at some point, maybe I should introduce you to one of my other clients, Dr. Ginger Campbell. She has a long-running podcast, Brain Science, where 12, 13 years now, every month there's an 1.5 to 2 hour episode about neuroscience. And for 12 years, they've been talking. She's brought back guests now that I've heard 2 or 3 times, where they're revising stuff because in the last 3 years they've learned something and and so they've changed, and it's just fascinating. But they consistently, like you said, they're talking about how we think this, or we think this, or this person disagrees, but we're now looking at this because we've gotten this. It just seems like it's like Star Trek, where it's like every there's a new frontier, every week there's something else they're figuring out. And on the show, I've heard you talk about, like I would call it, because I have a middle schooler. My daughter's a tween right now. I would call it peer pressure, but I've also heard you talk about like social norms, societal norms. How does that fit into copywriting, and how does that affect? Because I always think about like, well, if my neighbor gets a new car, I want a new car too, because I want to keep up with the Joneses or whatever. But what's going on there psychologically, or if it's with the brain, feel free to tell us more about the brain.
Social norms really are, they developed as an evolutionary necessity, right? Or if you don't like that term, as an adaptation that we've made as a species to survive. Because what we see others doing and being successful at, we want to mimic it. We want to make that our own norm because it's clearly helping them survive and thrive. So our brains think, oh, I need to do that so I can survive and thrive, and be part of a tribe as well. There was a study done by Robert Cialdini and others about hotel towels and social norms. So those little signs in hotels that say, hey, if you want to reuse your towel to help save the environment, just hang it back up and we won't clean it. But if you want a new one, leave it on the floor, put it in the bathtub, and we'll give you new towels. And so they did a bunch of different versions of that same sign, that same little hotel sign, and they found that social norms are actually quite powerful, even in how we use our towels in hotels. So it was something like, and this study was I think a decade ago. I expect the numbers would be higher now, but something like 40% of people would normally reuse their towels just with like a help save the environment type of message. But when you build in the social norm of join your fellow hotel guests or join your fellow guests that stayed in room 319, the numbers just skyrocket from there. So, yeah, even social norms about hotel towels. I mean, it's hardwired into our brain, back near our brainstem, right? We need to survive by being like others around us.
We're gonna get kicked out. We're gonna be out in the jungle,
all alone. We're not gonna survive.
Off the island, whatever. It's like, I think that's probably why Survivor works, and all the reality shows. You want to be on the island. You want to be part of the group.
I don't want to be the weakest link.
Yeah, I could ask you a ton of other questions, but so we don't run too long. What haven't I asked you that you think people really need to know about copywriting or why it's important, why it works, or what they need to know?
The biggest thing that I tell people is make sure that, like I already said, you need to align who you are as a brand and how you talk as a brand with the ideals of your ideal client, with who they aspire to be. So there's a really simple way to do that. I do it a bit more complex, but the really simple way to do it is just open up a spreadsheet, pop in 5 columns, write out 4 or 5 personality traits of your brand, right? Maybe you're energetic, maybe you're a disruptor, maybe you're authentic or academic or whatever. Write out if your brand was a person, what would its personality traits be? And then the second, that's the first column. The second column is just describe that. So if you're energetic as a brand, what does that mean? You can write it out in a sentence or 2. And then the third and fourth columns are do and don't. So if your brand is energetic and you've described what that means, what do you do in your copy? That would probably mean that you're using active voice in the do column, and don't would be you're not using passive voice, right? If you're energetic, you're using fast moving stories. You're not, that's under the do's. You're not under the don'ts. You're not being, using overly long sentences and really long words. And then the fifth column is just any extra notes that you have. So do that for each of the 4 or 5 personality traits of your brand, and you're already 10 steps ahead of your competition just by defining not your avatar yet, but your brand and who you are. And then the next level stuff is, aligning that to the clients that you're working with. But that's a good way to start. And folks can go to my website as well, or go to my podcast. I always drop that link in the show notes to grab that brand voice template, which gives a lot more than just those columns, but a lot more detail as well.
Okay. I'll make sure to share all that information in the show notes. And if, I don't say if, people should definitely go and check out the podcast. It's good to start like with episode 1, but is there a particular episode in this first group? And by the time this airs, you'll probably have 10 episodes out. So maybe you have them mapped out and you know what you're going to talk about. Is there a particular episode you think would be really interesting for people to check out first?
That is a great question, because each new episode I put out becomes my new favorite. So I don't really know. What I'll say is, first of all, episode 2 is probably a really good foundation. It's the one with psyops and story structure. Okay. So that's a great one. The one that I'm working on right now is going to drop on election day, and it's about why what's going on in our brains as we're trying, as people are trying to change our political beliefs. So our identity core beliefs. The study was a bunch of folks like us, crazy liberals, who were shown conservative statements and what's going on in their brain at the time, and how do we apply that to copywriting and getting people to buy our stuff. So that one's my current favorite. But like I said, every new episode, every new idea is my new favorite. So cool. Check out episode 2 and then just keep going from there. Maybe they'll be your favorite.
Awesome.
Each new one too.
Awesome. Well, thank you for spending the time with me today. This is going to be a very valuable episode for my listeners, I think, to check out.
Awesome. Yeah, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey folks, I wanted to take a moment to tell you a little bit about a tool that I use every month. It's called Text Expander, and I get a monthly email from them where they report on how much time I have saved by using Text Expander. And I just love getting this because I'm looking at last month, and I saved close to an hour and 17 minutes using Text Expander. If you're not familiar with it, Text Expander basically allows you to insert snippets of text in any app from a library of content that you have created. So I have simple things like my email address and my phone number and my home address, all the way to email templates that I've created or answers to questions that I answer all the time. I can easily shoot these snippets into any app, any email, any document that I'm creating, and it saves a ton of time. I would love for you to check them out. If you are interested in using Text Expander, just go to dannyosmond.com/textexpander for more information.